Hey guys, so back at you now with the Pre-U Economics 2019 Paper 2 macro section. What are the sort of top picks essay-wise that I've been able to identify? Well, let's take a little look. All right, let's start off with international firstly. Now, within the international realm, globalization has been a real biggie over recent years. There was a case study on globalization in last year's Paper 1. That's well worth having a look at if you haven't seen that already, because there's a decent chance globalization could feature. Because it's really faced a few challenges, a few headwinds in recent times. If you think about, say, Trump and his tariffs and protectionism and the sort of trade war with China, there's also the whole Brexit issue as well. Some argue that that's an example of deglobalization in action. Other free marketeer or free market economists would actually argue, that's Britain actually wanting to engage more in the world. So, it does depend on the perspective there as well. Now, it's created enormous benefits for the global economy. Now, here, of course, you need to make sure that you distinguish between the different types of economy, LEDCs versus MEDCs, and their differing experiences as a result of this. We know that there's been a vast amount of structural change within MEDCs, of course. So is it overwhelmingly desirable? And then you can think about the actual stakeholders. Who is it desirable for? Who is it not desirable for? And so on. Okay, so evaluate this statement. That's ETS there. All right, nice one. So in 2016, the UK ran a current account deficit of over 7% of GDP, posing a threat to its macroeconomic stability. The depreciation of the pound will help to correct this imbalance. So, there's a decent chance we might see something about the depreciation of the pound because it was such a significant event. I think it's the largest exchange rate fall in certainly in recent years for an MEDC to face such a big drop in the value of its currency. Okay, now at the time, of course, the UK economy was running a really large current account deficit, and this is a persistent imbalance that they've had here. So it's more than possible to actually argue that was actually a really desirable circumstance. Okay, that actually it's helped us to actually reduce the size of this imbalance and so on. So there's a chance. We might get something on depreciation of the pound, the J curve, the Marshall-Lerner condition, and so on. Okay, so there we go. Evaluate this statement. Next up, comparative advantage. Well, it's been a little while since comparative advantage has featured. We saw a multiple choice question on it just the other day, but again, there's a decent chance this could feature as well. Okay, so to what extent is comparative advantage, or rather comparative advantage will always be the primary driving force behind increased international trade? Evaluate this statement. Something along those lines there, okay? So really understanding of comparative advantage, but also understanding how different today's economy is against the very simplistic model that David Ricardo drew up when he came up with the principle of comparative advantage. And of course, you can then bring into this type of essay globalization as well, protectionism, etc. All right, good stuff. Increased economic integration is always mutually beneficial. Evaluate this statement. Well, this is a change in the specification where it was talking specifically in the spec about European Union. Now it's become a lot broader and is looking at economic integration more broadly. So this is an interesting essay. Now, here, of course, you've got the removal of the actual tariff and then the common external tariff that will accompany things like customs unions, for instance. Okay, but you can then actually explore other areas such as trade creation, trade diversion, of course, okay, and to what extent increased economic integration truly is desirable. All right. Good stuff. So let's move along. Let's have a look at the national economy. Right. So higher levels of inflation will always result in increased levels of employment. Okay. So it's possible we might see something regarding the Phillips curve. It's been a little while since the Phillips curve has appeared. Yeah, there's a chance we might see this. Now, just notice what we've got here. When it comes to inflation, you've got to consider the differing causes of inflation there, whether it's cost push, whether it's demand pull. Okay, with demand pull inflation, of course, well, you are likely to see increases in employment at the same time. However, if it's cost push, then you may well face a situation of stagflation, for instance. Okay, that's obviously not so good for employment. All right. Another interesting question there. Okay, moving on. So I'd highlighted inequality on the micro. I'm highlighting here on the macro as well. Addressing inequality in wealth and income should be the primary government objective. Okay, discuss, evaluate the statement, whatever there. So how important is this notion of inequality, and how important is equality itself? So really making sure that you understand wider government macroeconomic objectives there and seeing where this actually ranks. Okay, so you're going to want to have some grasp of relative Gini coefficients for, say, the UK plus some other countries which are perhaps more equal, such as many of the Scandinavian countries, as well as those countries that are less equal. So the US, China, and of course, worst of all, I think, is about South Africa there. So that's another important issue to think about there. Okay, and you want to show more than just an understanding of progressive taxation and the importance of that. Okay, so what about the actual welfare system and how that can actually contribute to improving equality and how desirable ultimately that is. Right, great stuff. So persistent youth unemployment. So again, unemployment has been, it just hasn't featured in a little while. So that's why I've highlighted it under two different angles, really. Inflation and unemployment on its own here. So persistent youth unemployment is the most damaging of all forms of unemployment. So many of those so-called pig economies or pigs following the financial crisis still have these persistent high levels of youth unemployment. Now that is Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. Okay, so in those countries there has really been a issue with this level of high youth unemployment. So what can be done to actually address that balance? Okay, now of course in the context of the EU, that's a much broader question where you've got a country like Germany, say for instance, which has very high savings ratios, meanwhile exports loads of its products across the rest of Europe, and that therefore means that many of these countries end up with current account deficits. Okay, that's a broader issue. But anyway, what can be done to actually address this issue of youth unemployment? Okay, so whether it's apprenticeship schemes, whether it's retraining, okay, but then there's the bigger issue of how can you actually ensure that you are giving the youth the skills of tomorrow. I think I heard a Silicon Valley economist talking recently, an entrepreneur rather, and he was saying no one understands how much the world is going to change in the next 20 years apart from those in the Silicon Valley and those in Shenzhen. They really understand how things are going to change, but no one else does. So to what extent can the government actually help sort this issue out? Okay, so there's a wider issue there. And what about the implication for benefits, etc.? Okay, and then finally, we've got one on inflation targeting here. Okay, so Bank of England continues to miss its 2% inflation target. Instead, this target should be abolished, allowing them to pursue economic growth as the primary objective. So, just think about this element of the 2% CPI inflation target. How important is that? How desirable is that for us to actually have that inflation target? So that's another interesting question there. So guys, I hope that's been useful in terms of prepping you for these exams. Do let me know if you've got any questions. I'd be delighted to hear from you. All right, thanks a lot. Take care.